All right, so we are talking about Flying Blind. Adam, you were asking me who gave this book to me.
Well, in part, I was asking this because, I mean, as you mentioned, your mother, but it is so like on the screws, perfect, and like every page. Peter, you got to know Brian. For the 20 plus years I've known him, like he will pull out these aviation disasters as kind of parables that are finely honed for the situation. It's remarkable, and so like each page I turned, and also some of the things we've been reading and discussing on this Twitter space have been like kind of stories of how corporations got it right or got it wrong. So it's just this perfect intersectionality. So obviously, Brian, not surprisingly, your mom knows you very well.
She does me well, and I feel like are you aviation disaster shaming me? I mean, is this like I feel do I do this to a peculiar or off-putting degree? I mean, apparently I do. Is this an intervention? Is what I'm trying to ask.
I'm surprised. I don't know how to answer this. Like, do you hear other people like when you say like JAL 123? Like, does that mean anything to anybody else? Obviously, to Peter it does, but like to normal people, you know that it doesn't, right?
But it's okay. But I mean, are you picking on JAL 123 as a specific example? Because that's a germane crash, actually.
It's one I learned about in the book. Yes.
So that crash is actually as good a part as any to start. First of all, so Peter Robison, the author of Flying Blind. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. And let's actually start with JAL 123, just because Adam brought it up, and this crash is horrifying. So there was a second set of rivets that were effectively missing, and there'd been a tail strike earlier on this aircraft. The tail blew off mid-flight, and you really badly need the tail. And this crash was awful because people knew and Peter, maybe you know off the top of your head, but
Brian, I'm going to interject just for a second because Peter, we lost you as a speaker again.
Oh, whoops.
So
were you wondering how long it would take us to find out that we've lost Peter as a speaker as I go off on JAL 123? No, but this crash is terrible because this aircraft is doing these massive oscillations, and people basically know that they're going to crash. And this is not a crash you want to be in. And Peter, I thought what was amazing about this horrifying crash is that Boeing, and I didn't realize this, that Boeing had accepted responsibility to a surprising degree for the crash. I never attributed this as a Boeing failure necessarily, but maybe you could lead us off there in terms of did we lose Peter again? Oh, Twitter Spaces. Oh, Twitter Spaces.
For folks, as we were getting set for this, Peter said, "Wow, this was super easy to get started."
We're just hold on to those warm feelings, Peter.
Yeah,
you're gonna need them later. I feel like I'm in the same kind of bad relationship with the dishwasher right now. And when we were talking about lunch, and one of my coworkers was kind of laughing at me, like, who's in a bad relationship with the dishwasher? And I'm like, well, I'm getting a specific error code. He's like, wait a minute, is it an E24? I'm like, yeah, it's an E24 and a Bosch dishwasher. It's like, looks like we're in the same bad relationship. But this dishwasher knows to give me an error code whenever I begin to believe that it can function reliably. That's when it knows to fail. And I feel like Twitter Spaces is wired into the same. Like, it's whenever I begin to believe in Twitter Spaces that it fails. And now where is Peter? He's not.
He seems to. It was in an odd state where it seemed to have thought he was waiting to speak, and was not currently in the space.
Yeah. Oh man. Oh, Twitter. Please get this working robustly for people.
Yeah, seriously.
So much promise. I guess there we go. There's Peter's back, and
hi, I'm back. How much of that did you hear? Could I ask?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. All right. So Yes, the JAL 123 was an example of the integrity that Boeing had at that point in the mid 80s. This plane, that their marquee plane, the 747, had crashed into a mountainside, and the authorities in Japan were settling in for what they assumed would be long, arduous negotiations for Boeing to accept responsibility. But Boeing did accept responsibility within a month, and admitted that it was its own faulty repair job that had caused the crash, which short circuited what you saw with the Max, which was this long fight that was painful for all involved. So yeah, so that is a great place to start, because it really shows what's been lost.
Well, and I think the other thing that's interesting about that, but kind of that period then for Boeing, is when the 777 then, because I associate Boeing aircraft with the 777 because it was done in a different kind of way. Peter, you talked a lot about the development of the 777 in the book as an interesting point of contrast.
Yeah, and it was the airplane that Boeing did next after that 747 crash, and what was I heard it described as Boeing's Camelot. It was a period when you had engineers in charge of the company. The mantra for the program was working together. The idea was that customers, suppliers, Boeing's engineers would all work together to develop an airplane that worked from the first day. And it went 18 years before it had a fatal crash, and it's still considered one of the best airplanes Boeing's ever made.
And I remember at the time. And Adam, do you remember the 777 being developed?
I remember the launch of it to fanfare, but I was, as I said, not as plugged in necessarily to the launch of it as you might have been.
Well, because they also made a really big deal about the fact that they were working with pilots on. They made a big deal about the human factors in the cockpit. Peter, am I remembering that correctly?
That's true. Yeah, that they did emphasize, because there was it was a point where Boeing had to consider should it adopt side stick controllers as Airbus had, how much pilot involvement is really needed, and so they analyzed it and kept with the control yokes as they'd had in the past, but also with a substantial amount of human pilot input. So they carefully considered the human factors every step of the way. And the interesting thing was that on previous Boeing airplanes, the chief test pilot had his name scrawled, his or her name, although it was all men, scrawled under the window on the side. And instead, on the 777, just that slogan, "Working together," was scrawled on the side.
So that to me is really interesting, and it ends up being standing in stark contrast, I feel, to the Max and what happened to Boeing. That very team-oriented approach that Boeing had, it seemed to be really selfless in a way. Is that it? Is that a fair assessment? I see that Peter's connecting. Peter's gone again. Why Twitter Spaces? Why are we going to get our postmortem on Twitter Spaces? I want Tom. I want the NTSB to investigate every.
Yeah. I don't think anyone's dying in this crash.
That's right.
Yeah, fair enough.
So you mentioned the team-oriented response, and I missed the end of the question.
Yeah, it just feels like, as I was reading about the Max, and the thing that over and over again, you see the executive leadership in Boeing act in a ultimately very selfish way. And it just feels like, wow, this company was not that long ago so team-oriented, and it became so self-serving, it feels like. And how did it make that journey so quickly? It's distressing, because it seemed to me as a reader that self-serving nature really manifested itself in some of the problems in the Max.
Yeah, we could talk a long time on that question, because I think it is partly generational. The leaders of Boeing.
What the heck? Jeez.
Come on. This is where, we need Tom. Tom. Oh man, this
has got to be connectivity on his side.
Yeah, you think? Yeah. I know it's time to like turn on the Wi-Fi, turn off the Wi-Fi, turn on and off the Wi-Fi.
Go talk to
Change
that
your remote
FBI
network.
van.
Right, go talk to the FBI van. Exactly. Is there a Boeing van in your front yard by any chance? And Adam, you had not, I assume, seen this book before?
No. My mom did not get this for me, but I was delighted for the recommendation. And you're talking about the development of the 777, and to me that had a lot of kind of soul of the new machine kind of feel of it. It was a less depth in the construction of it, but that same kind of firing on all cylinders, kind of the product of the team really coming to fruition. Did you get any sense of that as well?
For sure. I mean, I feel that like. I know you and I have both felt this about our own careers, that when I look at the stuff that I am the most proud of as an engineer are the things that I have worked with other people on. It is when we have gone, like, when a team does something that feels beyond their individual grasp.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
The 777, and I love the fact that the motto is working together. The 777 does feel like the name plus ultra there. Peter, we are so you may want to try like. Connectivity feels like it might be. Tom tells us it's connectivity.
Yeah.
So.
Let me. I'll move to another spot. Yeah. I don't. If there's any other tips, you have a highly tech savvy audience.
I mean,
so,
Tom,
yeah.
that does sound like blaming the pilots. But
That's right. Exactly.
It's the ground crew.
It's right. I know. It's Tom's going to blame the poor network maintenance there on. But so, I mean, and Peter, I've got like a ton of questions. And I in terms of like where to start, there are lots of places to start. I think one of the things I'm just curious from your own perspective, because you're talking about the 777, you started covering. You're gone again.
Oh.
No, you're. Oh, no. Hold on, these are just a second. Because Peter, you were a reporter for Bloomberg. Covering Boeing at about this time, right? I mean, you said it started covering them certainly before the McDonnell Douglas acquisition.
I had. And can you hear me? I should ask. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, I'd started covering aerospace in the mid '90s when I worked for Bloomberg in Europe, and so I started covering aerospace then, and then I moved to Seattle in '98, and that was a year after the McDonnell Douglas merger, and so I was really hearing and seeing the effects of that and the infighting that resulted.
Okay, so tell me about that, because I guess, I mean, I'm curious about your relationship with this story, and when you had a very early seat in terms of the challenges with the merger and the shifting culture at Boeing. Wow. You need to. So you may want to try if Wi-Fi is turned on your device, turn it off.
Yeah, I'm actually on the. Yeah,
I'm on.
I'll try to turn it on. I'm on the wireless. So yeah, let me try. Let me try that.
I cannot tell you how embarrassing it is for the domain that I have to just basically tell you to try something else. I mean, we can't get our act together. Like we can't even get our act together enough to discuss plane crashes, let alone aspire to building safety critical systems.
Well, you haven't told me to turn it off and on yet, so
I feel that's right, or just reboot
right.
it. Which it's very frustrating. Anyway, so I mean, because you've got kind of a front row seat watching the Boeing culture shift, and I'm sure you were talking to people who were concerned that, because at that point, McDonnell Douglas, certainly with all the challenges of the DC-10, had a reputation for being more financially oriented than engineering oriented.
Yeah, and the thing that I experienced as a young reporter was in 2000, which was the engineers' strike at Boeing, and that was an unusual thing because it wasn't particularly over wages and benefits. It was more over the direction of the company because these engineers who'd been through that experience of developing the 777 and feeling that the company was interested in developing products. They suddenly were seeing the winds shift, and they were seeing managers from McDonnell Douglas come in who had more of a short-term mentality, and at the time it was the largest white-collar strike in American history. And I'm going to ask can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
we can hear
great.
You.
I get it. I've gone through this a few times, so I get nervous when it's quiet. But
yeah, I know.
So
sorry.
Anyway, so yeah, but at that time you also had the ascendance of General Electric, and that was and Jack Welch was really the model at the time.
And we are losing him. Okay, so the Jack Welch thing is so honest. So I was and with when the 737 Max with these two crashes, and I remember speaking about this actually in 2019. And my concern was that when we fully understood this, it was going to be revealed that Boeing had succumbed to a kind of Facebook-like move fast, break things kind of mentality, a kind of a Silicon Valley damn the consequences mentality. And that's not really correct.
No.
It's really not the Facebook pathology. It's the Jack Welch pathology that actually Jack Welch is actually to that kind of zeitgeist and the finance oriented thinking was really much more to blame.
Yeah, it was definitely not the short term risk taking. You're right. It was the myopic cost cutting.
And so, Peter, did you try rebooting it,
Peter? That's next. But you were. I think I just caught the end of that. You were talking about the short term thinking and Jack Welch.
Well, and just in terms of what you were beginning to see with the strike at Boeing, and beginning to see this very the cost cutting mentality, finance oriented mentality. I mean, it's like in a company, you've got several key stakeholders. Mm-hmm. You've got shareholders and investors, you've got employees, and you've got customers, and then you've got kind of society writ large. And to me, the ordering, when you obviously don't want to have to choose between these things, but the culture of a company is kind of dictated by how those choices are made. And they were very clearly, with the 777, they were very clearly choosing, I mean, clearly my belief is you choose customers first. But they were clearly not choosing customers first. They were choosing the finance first, the shareholders first, ultimately the investors first.
Yeah, and that came across, at these moments when you felt finance was ascendant. I mean, and that was early 2000s when the mantra was 5 and 5. We can quadruple the stock price in 5 years, and then just before the first Max crash, Boeing CFO had a meeting with his finance staff, and the stock was about 300, 350 at the time, and he was talking about that if they kept doing what they were doing, it could get to 800 or 900. There was real excitement at Boeing, that it was finally joining the big leagues of these global powerhouses. So, Dennis Muhlenberg repeatedly talked about, how he saw Boeing as a global industrial champion, and you could sense his excitement that after all this time at Boeing, that it was, he thought, finally performing and satisfying Wall Street.
But go ahead, Adam. Because
well, Peter, you mentioned in the book the parallels with Enron, and I just listened to a great podcast about Enron, and I was fascinated about it in 2003, 2004. Was it that same kind of underlying mentality? And bravo to your child or roommate who ended up practicing.
Well, I did move, and I moved into the earshot of a clarinet lesson. So
That's
it
great.
does sound good.
Adam and I aspire to get our children to do anything as remotely productive as clarinet. So honestly, that's very impressive.
You're inspiring. Yes.
So sorry, Adam. Do you want to?
Just like what the parallels with the Enron seemed really spot on, and we lost Peter again, despite the clarinet.
Despite the clarinet.
In terms of like Boeing aspiring to be not just a maker of planes, but this global industrial complex, and it seemed to work out sort of. I mean, maybe slightly better for them, but not that much better.
But also, like, how does Boeing have an inferiority complex? Like, I don't understand. Like, you're the maker of the 777. You are an American industrial powerhouse. Why do you feel you need Jack Welch like financial engineering to appease Wall Street? I mean, it seems like such a strange inferiority complex for a company to have, to think that it hadn't achieved all. I mean, because to me, it was an American icon, but apparently that's not enough.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, that inferiority complex really did come through in that early 2000 period, and that was in part driven by Harry Stonecipher, who came in ironically from McDonnell Douglas, which had been the also ran, and really drove home the message that Boeing, in his words, had never been a successful business over the last 50 years, that it hadn't performed well enough to meet Wall Street's demands, and that they may be great engineers, but people are in companies exist to make money, which is an almost direct quote of his, and so Phil Condit, who was Boeing's CEO at the time and had been a great engineer through his career, felt did feel insecure about his position with Wall Street. There was one meeting in the late 90s where he was almost in tears after describing the browbeating he'd taken in New York. So that's what I was getting at in talking about the inferiority complex. That's kind of in the DNA over the last 20, 30 years.
Oh God, that is just so corrosive to have your CEO, who is, by the way, coming from the company that you putatively acquired. I mean, this is McDonnell Douglas. I mean, just amazing to me. And obviously it's not lost on the Boeing engineers. McDonnell Douglas had a terrible track record, the DC-10. And I'm actually, one question I'm dying to ask you, Peter, is because you didn't have the rise and fall of the DC-10 in your bibliography, but I'm sure you obviously knew a lot about the DC-10. I mean, clearly the Boeing engineers knew that the DC-10 had been very problematic. MD-11 had been very problematic, and to have like this turkey tell you, that you're that the company has been misrun, it just feels so abusive. I mean, it's just shocking.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, and that's you're getting at where the infighting, where the frustration, comes from on the side of the longtime Boeing employees, because the DC-10 had problems, had repeated crashes, and McDonnell Douglas had been cited in a well-regarded, well-read book, Built to Last, by Jim Collins, as the reference company, the not visionary company, and Boeing was cited as the visionary company. So, it sounds like you've done your share of DC-10 reading over the years.
Well, it was a specific book that was recommended to me, as I kind of made reference to in that original Twitter thread, when the company I was at, Sun Microsystems, was dealing with a really serious quality problem. And it was recommended to me to understand how corporate culture affects quality, and which it emphatically does, and it did in McDonnell Douglas. And then to have that infect Boeing is just tragic. I mean, it is and Stonecipher honestly, it does not sound sympathetic. A question that I'm just dying to ask you, that I think I'm just going to get out earlier rather than later. Good God, the rampant infidelity among these executives. I mean, are any of these people true to their spouses? Was that as shocking to you as it is to the reader? Maybe I'm.
Yeah. I mean, that's partly why I included it. I was surprised by that. Yeah.
In the first half of the book, I feel like every other page was some notion of some description of some passing description of infidelity. You didn't linger, to your credit, Peter, but you also kind of helped understand the mentality of some of these folks. And then one of them was also married to their cousin as one of their, but had to fly to Oregon to get married or something. Anyway, perhaps neither here nor there, but it was all fairly shocking.
I have to say, I mean, and obviously, I love this book, and I loved this book it is so well written, which is sadly not the norm, but it is well written. It is so well sourced, and the footnotes are terrific. I love the way you presented some of these details that Adam is talking about, where you didn't really editorialize them. It's like, I'm just going to kind of drop this like factually true statement out here, and I'll let you, the reader, kind of figure out what do you make of this.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your reading it. And I felt and your comments and careful thinking about it. It really is something that I felt I had to write because I had seen this shift in the culture, and I did think that culture does play a huge role in a company's performance, in product, in what we ultimately experience. So thank you.
And I'm sure you were hearing these predictions after the McDonald acquisition, and you got the strike, and I'm sure you got, and because I've been in corporate cultures where you can feel them changing out from underneath you, and as an engineer, you kind of want to be wrong. As an engineer, you're like, I hope I'm wrong, but I feel that this is going to manifest itself in an unsafe aircraft. I'm sure you must have been hearing that in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the hard thing is that there's always going to be a certain amount of grumbling and trying to read the tea leaves at any company. So it's trying to understand what is truly going to cause a problem. And the thing about the aircraft industry is that it takes place over so many years. So even if a mistake is being made, you may not see the evidence of that mistake for 10 years, and then it plays out over a very long time, over the loss of market share, and then eventually, the death of the company. And you saw that, people in the aerospace industry, even, a great book that I read, which is widely read, is, The Sporty Game by John Newhouse, which was written in the early 70s. And in that book, you could sense that McDonnell Douglas was not long for the industry, but it took 20 years for that to actually play out, 25 years even.
And so because the timeframes are so long, did you have, with all the connections that you had at Boeing, did you have any sort of advanced indicator that the 737 MAX posed a risk to the traveling public? Or was your first indicator the Lion Air crash?
No, yeah, that's a great question, and no, I didn't. And first there was the Lion Air crash, and then there it was unusual, although it was playing out mostly in the trade press, that there was this conflict between Lion Air and Boeing over the cause of the crash. But to most people thought it would be a one-off and that Boeing would fix it. And the real shocking thing was the second crash and the fact that it was the same problem. And I had talked to people at the time who said they could not understand how Boeing didn't move with speed to fix this software issue, which it knew, within a week of the first crash, that it would have to correct.
And certainly just the fact that they knew so quickly that Mcas was involved, and the fact that they had such a quick hunch tells you how much internally they were afraid this was going to be an issue. When you first heard that Lion Air crash, did you have kind of some immediate realization that, good God, this is the McDonnell Douglas coming home to roost? Was that your initial thought?
It wasn't. It really took the second crash for me to engage more with the story and try to understand what happened, because it was after the second crash that it became clear there was a problem.
I would just like to put in a short plug for Ethiopian Airlines. Have you ever flown Ethiopian, Peter?
I have not.
Ethiopian is great. Have you flown Ethiopian, Adam?
No, but our sponsor this week is Ethiopian
Ethiopian Airlines. Have you? No, I have. Have I already talked to you?
No. But please go.
Ethiopian is great. No, I took Ethiopian because Ethiopian flies what's called a Fifth Freedom Flight, which is a flight that neither the origin nor the destination are the flag of the carrier from LAX to Dublin on its way to Addis Ababa. And because if you draw a line from LA to Addis Ababa, it goes to Dublin. So I flew from LAX to Dublin for my father-in-law's funeral, actually, with my then 4-year-old daughter. They were great. They were such a good airline. They were just so. I mean, it's just very clear that you have absolutely the pride of Ethiopia on pilots, flight attendants. I mean, the aircraft were in great shape. It was just like a great airline. And because I kind of feel, Peter, certainly with the Lion Air crash, and you talk about this in the book, there's this kind of sense that that Boeing basically says that this is a shoddy airline. Mm-hmm. And it's a discount carrier, it's in Indonesia, and it's kind of gross. It's like, this is one of your customers, and you are implying, and not just even implying, like outright stating that they are not, that this is pilot error effectively before we know anything about the crash. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty galling. So with the Ethiopian crash, I don't know. I felt as a person who'd been a passenger on Ethiopian, I was somewhat relieved that they didn't seem to try the same things with Ethiopian and malign the airline. They seemed to accept that there was a 737 MAX problem here.
Yeah, it became much harder to say that it was an airline-specific problem after that second crash. Although you did still hear that same message, in that Sam Graves, the congressman from Missouri, was still taking up that message in May after the second crash, and saying that you have to know how to fly the plane. So quietly behind closed doors, it's lobbyists were still pushing that message. But yes, publicly after the second crash, Boeing couldn't overtly blame its customer in the way it had with Lion Air.
Peter, you say that, but then in 2020, when they ungrounded the plane, it sounded like there were still some rumblings of gaslighting of the customers and the pilots.
Yeah, that's true. And Dave Calhoun in 2020. He's asked by New York Times reporters, would the same event have occurred with American pilots on a U.S. airline? And he asked to go off the record. And then when they said no, he said, "Oh, forget it. You know the answer." So, yeah, it seems, they can't help themselves. But I think him asking to go off the record means they also know that they feel they can't say that anymore publicly.
Of all the terrible sort of moments and terrible folks and terrible decisions in the book, that one actually really stuck with me, because you also described, people failing in the simulator, saying, there was some activity that the pilots needed to take within 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. And basically every pilot failed this test that they put it through. So it didn't really have to do with some deficiency of these pilots.
Yeah. You still had that was an inspector in Dallas who took it upon himself to run a similar test to what had happened in the crashes, and that instructor was finding that pilots weren't able to recognize it as quickly as someone who was expecting it in a test.
So can we just get into the technical details here just for a second? Because I've got kind of a burning question here about the angle of attack indicator is very closely linked to the problem, in that stunningly they only use a single angle of attack indicator for input to Mcas. Is that correct, Peter?
Yeah, and the idea is that the pilot is the backup, so it's not a single thread. You have the pilot as a backup. And
this is where but your brain must want to just like pop when people try to make that argument. The pilot doesn't know this is happening. It's like, how can the pilot be a backup when he doesn't know that Mcas has effectively taken over? And could we talk about the AOA disagree light?
Well, hey, Brian, before we get there,
sorry,
Peter. I mean, for folks who have not read it yet, maybe Peter, you could talk a little bit about Mcas because it's so kind of critical to understanding this pathology.
Sure. So Mcas is a piece of software that's designed to intervene if the pitch of the plane is going to, if the nose is going too high and the plane is likely to enter a stall. And so if the AOA indicator senses that the angle is too high, it'll the tail will move, and then the nose of the plane will push down. However, in the Lion Air case, what happened was that the AOA indicator was reading too high and the nose was pushed down. And the thought was that pilots would be, because when the tail is moving, there's a wheel in the plane that moves, and it's to keep the plane in trim. And the thought was that pilots would notice the wheel moving and would intervene. However, that didn't happen because that wheel also moves when the plane is meant to, when the plane needs to stay automatically in trim, as happens all through the flight. So in this case, it was just a very surprising set of events that was soon after takeoff, and it's also unusual that would be happening soon after takeoff as well. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for just to emphasize this point, like Mcas is software, which is overriding effectively the human pilots.
Right.
It is software that they don't know about because it is only in the glossary of the documents for the Macs. There's no actual, and Peter, maybe you want to go into why they fought to eliminate Mcas even from the documentation for the aircraft.
Well, the main thing was that it would have potentially changed the level of training needed for the newer version of the 737. It's hugely expensive for pilots to train on a new model. So Boeing from the start wanted to have only level B training, which is what you get if you're training on an iPad, and not level D, which is simulator training. And if Mcas had been emphasized as a new feature, it might have jeopardized this level D training, and that would have triggered, potentially, Boeing had promised Southwest Airlines $1 million an airplane if they did need simulator training.
Yeah, and I think that this particular issue is an interesting issue where the customer is not necessarily always right, or at least you need to be transparent with the customer. The customers they want an aircraft that flies like their extant 737 fleet, so they don't need to retrain. And what Boeing needed to do was have a transparent conversation with Southwest and explain why we can't do that. Like that, what you're asking for is actually going to yield an aircraft that's going to do things behind the pilot's back. And we actually have to explain that. But they didn't want to do that, apparently, to their customers just because of the cost involved in the training.
That's an interesting point. There was a similar situation with the previous version of the 737 in the 90s, the next gen versions, and Southwest again was at that time was the one wanting the minimal changes, and they wanted to stick to these old kind of analog style dials on the displays. Boeing knew that others would want more modern dials. They were calling the old ones the steam gauges, and so they sort of quietly, designed in the newer displays, but then told Southwest, they could have their version, and then eventually Southwest came around, pretty soon after the planes entered service, and said, can we get these new dials? And Boeing said, sure, and all we have to do is switch a button because they had already designed it.
Was Southwest one of the two airlines that actually wanted the AOA indicator?
They didn't have the raw indicator. So their airplanes would not have gotten that disagree light either.
Who did have the AOA indicator?
I know that American did. That came up in the meeting between Boeing and its pilots later. The one of the union reps took credit for having pushed for the indicator.
So could you explain what the AOA indicator is and why it's so important and why it's so germane to these crashes?
Yeah, it's in these crashes, so there's two indicators, one on each side of the plane. It switches on each flight which of these indicators is feeding into the Mcas, and so in the Lion Air crash, you had you had a situation where clearly the AOA information was wrong, and that would have been helpful information for the pilots to have. However, the Lion Air pilots didn't see an alert saying AOA disagree because they hadn't bought a separate AOA indicator because the software had been incorrectly it had been incorrectly designed so that only the customers who had purchased the indicator got this disagree light. So it was just a cascading series of errors that were never disclosed, that at the time hadn't been disclosed to customers or the FAA.
It really was. And what a disaster to not have that AOA disagree light. Because I feel like, as someone who was just reading kind of the trade press at the time, there was this kind of strong implication that Lion Air and Ethiopian had opted to not purchase something that would have made the aircraft more reliable. There was some redundancy feature that they hadn't purchased, was kind of the implication. And that's actually not the case at all. The AOE indicator is a raw indicator that the pilot shouldn't necessarily need to see, was my read on it. Mm-hmm. And that not many airlines actually used it. I mean, American apparently did, and apparently there's at least one or two others, but most airlines did not opt for it. Is that correct?
Yeah, and from what I was told, that the AOA indicator it's often used by Navy pilots. That's something that they need to land on carriers, and so AOA and hitting the making sure their tail isn't hitting the deck is important to them. So it's important to some pilots. It's not important to others, but it would have been important to all pilots, and especially the maintenance crew, to know that the AOA was an issue after that first flight.
Especially astounding because the flight, if I understood this correctly, that same aircraft that was in that Lion Air crash failed in a similar way in a previous flight, but the deadhead pilot did what you had mentioned earlier, noticed the trim wheel moving, and they were able to correct it. But then the ground crew never got that indicator. So even though the previous flight and that same aircraft had gone through the same scenario that could have easily have led to that same crash, the ground crew, even when alerted of that, couldn't make the appropriate repairs.
Yeah, it's chilling. And one of the Boeing CEOs who met with American Airlines pilots later told them, on your airplane this wouldn't have happened because you bought the AOA indicator essentially.
But it's like you bought the undercoat on the car, like the racing stripe. Right. I mean, like the thing, right? I mean, like the thing you bought. Like, I get it. For a Navy pilot, it's a little bit skeuomorphic, and the idea that Lion Air certainly was not. There was not a common understanding. Even it sounds like at the FAA that the AOA was actually load bearing with respect to the safety of the aircraft.
Yeah, and it is something that later the FAA was surprised to learn about, and it this decision to not update the software and fix the problem was made at a level, after a safety review board meeting of Boeing, and was not shared with the FAA at the time.
Yeah, so because it seems to me that the fact that there was I just cannot wrap my head around the fact that a single indicator was being used to fly the aircraft. I mean, it just feels like, and clearly some engineers did have an allergic reaction to this and did point out that we should at least be looking at both of these indicators. If they disagree, let the pilot fly the aircraft, which is what I know they have since done. But I think that this kind of is a decent segue, Peter, to Curtis Eubank, who, if there's a hero to the story, am I wrong to read too much heroism into Curtis Eubank, a young engineer who seems to be really trying to speak truth to power on the peril of having a single AOA indicator? Is that a fair read?
Yeah, I mean, he's somebody who, at great risk to his his career, stood up both before and after the crashes to ask for to ask for more safety instrumentation on the plane. The reason that the AOA indicator is seems to be ancient is that the 737 was designed in the 60s, and it does in some cases have these, the engineers call them single thread designs, but in this case the single thread was considered okay because the pilots were supposed to be the backup. As we discussed, that was no longer, that should have been re-examined when pilots aren't even aware of this feature that had been added. But Eubank and others at Boeing who proposed to executives, they were allergic to the alerting system. They felt that the alerting system was outdated for the pilots, and they proposed a synthetic, what's something called synthetic airspeed, which would have shut off, which would have prevented some of these, which would have prevented Mcas from activating on the basis of one single outlandish reading. There would have been a second pair of eyes on sensors throughout the aircraft to prevent it from doing outlandish things on the basis of bad pieces of information.
And so you obviously, I gather that you talked to Eubank for the book. Is that?
I can't talk about my sources for the.
Oh, fair enough.
Book,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I thought that he had been quoted verbatim from you, but I guess not. But
he's written many letters to. That's what I meant about him talking. Speaking out after. That he's wrote at least 2 letters to Congress, and one filing to the FAA talking about what further improvements were needed on the Max.
And this is all obviously after both crashes. Because I have to say, I wonder, as an engineer, there are times you really don't want to be vindicated, and you kind of like, God, I hope I'm wrong. And in his case, not only was he right, but with so many lives lost, it must be psychologically very must weigh on one. I thought of, and you made reference to the Challenger disaster at the end of the book. And I know that many of the engineers there were decisions that they didn't make. They ultimately really weighed on them. And it must have been really difficult for these 737 engineers who had been kind of shouted down.
Yeah, it's, and you mentioned the Challenger crash. I mean, the engineers who were involved in that went to their graves, still talking about, talking to people they'd worked with on that, and did they do enough to raise alarms? It's the difficult thing with this is that it's easy to think of your role as being just one small piece of it, and it is so compartmentalized that maybe there's a part of you that can say, well, it wasn't me because I only did X, piece of equipment or X system, and that's why I focus so much time in the book on leaders like Joe Sutter, who did see their role as trying to make sure that everyone saw how their small piece of the project contributed to the whole, and that's a real talent, and people I came across who could explain that were I just had huge respect for.
Totally. And this whole, and again, it's, working together, right, on the 777, and the whole idea that not only do we all have an important role to play, but we also have a each of us has a responsibility. And one of the things that I definitely wonder is because obviously a bunch of us here are in software engineering or software engineers, and we've got a lot of software being written right now that is being used in ways that are ethically questionable for sure. And I wonder what was going through the minds of the engineers who are writing the Mcas code, or the engineers at Collins Aerospace was the sub on the AOA indicator. Mm-hmm. But did they write the Mcas? Was Mcas written at Boeing?
Mcas was written by a team at Boeing, which handed the specifications to Collins. So the issue was that the team at Boeing had not thought carefully through how they were designing it. So yeah.
But the actual MCAS software itself, the software that is kind of acting on this single sensor and is going to effectively fly the aircraft, that software is Boeing authored software.
It's a Boeing design that's handed to the supplier to execute yeah.
Okay, so yeah. So I mean, for us in software, this is an incredibly germane question. It's like because I think I mean, like Adam, aren't you like dying to see the actual source code for this thing?
I mean, sort of. I'm also just like that's the part of the book that made me so itchy, was thinking about like there's a person who wrote that code. There's a person who made the change to say the most I can move the flaps is 0.6 degrees, but then it changed later on to be whatever it was, 2 degrees.
Yeah.
And just I mean, either it's a senior engineer making that and they should feel itchy, or it's a junior engineer who is just being set up to fail. And in both cases, I think there's so many other failings in the book, but that just felt so close because, yeah, Brian, I can imagine kind of the simplicity in some ways of the code, the facileness of that code.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting kind of, it's either a senior engineer who's just like, okay, I'm going to take responsibility for it, but it feels like it's much more likely a junior engineer that is, or someone who is, if not junior in years, certainly not questioning why are we making this change and what are the consequences of it. It feels.
Yeah, I mean, by the time that change in MCAS was introduced to extend it to low speed situations, it was considered that the bulk of the work of the project was done. I was told that a lot of people had moved on to other projects by that point, and there was a small team that was assigned to work on it. So those are all great questions. Yeah, it's it's incredible to think of typing on a computer screen and then seeing a result like we saw.
Peter, one of the things about the MCAS, and I think you alluded to it earlier, is that there was a feeling, I believe you described, among pilots about Boeing that they preferred it to Airbus because the Boeing software would never take over. That the pilot was in control in a way more deterministically than they were with Airbus. And was that right? And can you describe that kind of scene as the pilots were informed about MCAS and their reaction?
Yeah, I mean, because Boeing had been considered always sort of the pilot's aircraft maker, that they didn't with the Airbus. I mean, the simplest way of understanding is that they have side stick controllers at Airbus, and so when the pilot on one side makes a change, the pilot on the other side doesn't feel that instantly in his controller. So there have been situations where confusion, crashes have happened because one pilot is unaware of what the other is doing. But with Boeing, both control yokes move, and there's the Boeing has continued to have that tactile feel in all their designs. So, but at the same time, planes are mostly controlled by flight control software now. So the fact that software took such control of a Boeing plane was shocking, because at Boeing the thought had been that yes, there was software, but pilots are still in control of it.
Well, and I wonder, Peter, if the software engineers that were working on that had that kind of that blood on the seats, as you call that. Was that a Joe Sutterism, or where does blood on the seats come from?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Well, you talk about blood on the seats and I'm trying to, is that a Joe Sutterism, or where does that come from?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Okay. Yeah, that was so this is the blood on the seat covers.
Yeah,
in the book. Yeah, this was a product safety manager who I talked to who was really giving an example of how the culture was in the 90s and earlier, that you had a strong understanding that product safety had to be paramount, that those people had to be represented at meetings. And he remembered, at a meeting on the 737 Next Gen, someone had proposed some changes to the fuel tank that he thought would leave a potential single point failure, and he stood up and said, how much blood do you want on the seat covers? And then eventually the design was changed. But that was what it took. You needed to have somebody stand up and say that at meetings, and from everything I've been told at the Max, you didn't have that, and it's because the finance function became dominant and the engineering function less so, and it was felt that you would risk your career if you stood up and said something like that.
Man, and to have that direct connection, I think, is so important. And it just feels like those who were writing software for the Mcas, and I can say I cannot wrap my brain around outsourcing flight control software to a subcontractor. I just feel that, nobody cares about your software like you do. And I think it's very hard to outsource responsibility. It's very hard to, I think it's obviously not impossible. And clearly, like, subcontractors are important for any large, complicated endeavor. But boy, it feels like they outsource. It's shocking to me that ultimately they were writing a specification and not the software itself for the Mcas.
Yeah, well, Boeing had over time, it's again, to cut costs, it's handed responsibilities for huge, pieces of the airplane. On the 787, they handed over, not just manufacturing work, but complete design on sections of the airplane, and that led to huge problems on the 787 with, ultimately $50 billion in costs, and now as the 787 is experiencing these manufacturing defects, you have this hunt, among suppliers worldwide to try to understand, why these defects are happening.
Well, and you say cost cutting, but I thought this was particularly stark that the 737 MAX was taken on because they thought they could do it for $3 billion, as opposed to a new plane costing $20 billion. Are those the right numbers?
Yeah, I think it was 2.5 for the derivative, and yeah, the new plane could cost as much as 20. Unfortunately, because of that experience with the 787, that may have played into Boeing's decision making as well, because they had sunk so much in the 787, it would have been difficult to swallow another new development. But if Boeing had followed the design plan it had laid out in the early 2000s, it would have had the 787 done years previously, and it would have introduced a new 737. And I was told by John Leahy, who ran sales at Airbus, that would have been potentially career threatening for him, because he had assured others at Airbus that Boeing wouldn't do that.
Yeah, if you think of like a 777 like aircraft that is targeted at the 737 market with an all glass cockpit and all of it just feels like they could have. Yes, sorry. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
I
can hear you.
Yeah. So I guess one question I would have is, economically, financially, strictly financially, this was ruinous. This decision that they did that they made with the 737 MAX. Has Boeing internalized that these were ruinous decisions and these were the wrong decisions, and we actually need to return to the old pre-McDonnell Boeing? Is that something? Because it feels like a lot of these people still have jobs. So I wonder how deeply that's been internalized.
It doesn't seem that it's been internalized, and the thing about.
Yep. God, we had such a good streak there.
Yeah, really.
This is what my dishwasher does, man. I'm telling you, Bosch dishwasher does the exact same thing. Long stretch, you think we're past it, and then it's E24, no dishes.
Hey, Matt, I noticed that you joined a little while ago as a speaker. While Peter's gone, can you tee up a question, or did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, so I did have a couple of questions there about, firstly, since all airplanes today are fly-by-wire, really it's the computer flying the plane. How different is Mcas from any of that, other than just a shoddy implementation of one? The second part that I've got is really surrounding the split between the notion that, like, there's substandard carriers crashing and the fact that there are options. And Is there some level of attitude there of like, well, of course you'd buy the whole plane if you were doing the responsible thing, where, you know, the notion internally is at least that the fact that you didn't buy the entire airplane and all of its bells and whistles, was that considered to be a sign of a substandard operator, even though on the business side, clearly no one is buying all of them?
Well, so two things on that. I mean, all these features seem to be standard on Airbus. And how crazy is it that you have an airplane with like an in-app purchase for a critical safety feature?
I know. Do you have like sorry folks, we need to divert our license manager crashed in the cockpit and we no longer, I mean, yeah, exactly.
So can you, I mean, that, imagine writing that piece of software. Like, you're saying that this safety piece of software I just wrote requires them to input a key to unlock this? Like, I mean, I think like you need to walk away at that moment, right?
You would hope. You would, and that is, I mean, at what point does a software engineer stand up and say, like, "Look, I'm not gonna push this. I'm not going to. This is not right. This is not. We're not going about this the right way. This is wrong by our customers." I mean, even aside from being safety critical, it is. We're going to get it back here.
Yeah.
Well, those are great questions. I mean, I definitely have the because the other thing I just find galling about this is the fact that all of this is happening without the pilot's awareness. Is just, I mean, without any indicator, without other. There he is. Hold on. All right, Peter. I think we got you back. Peter, you there?
Quite.
Nope. Getting there.
Oh, there we go.
Hello?
Yes.
Hey, Peter, you're back.
Hello?
So yeah, Peter, I'm not sure if you heard it, but Matt, yes, I can hear you.
Hi.
Hey, yeah. This is all because you praised Twitter Spaces early on. I'm telling you, you got it. It's the Matt. I think you had a good question for Peter.
Yeah. So
go ahead. Yeah.
I had two of them there. So firstly, to what degree within Boeing is it sort of considered that you had mentioned earlier that the notion was that these carriers that were seeing crashes were irresponsible in some way. And like, was there some sort of a disconnect on the business side and the engineering side where, of course, anyone who's reasonable would have bought most of the options on the plane? And versus, you know, standard operators who keep optioning it down. I think I said it better the first time, Brian.
Well, just in general, it's surprising that so much of the aircraft is like optional.
I'm not sure I'm getting you anymore.
You are. We can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this is just about the shift. You're asking about the shift to making more functions options as opposed to standard?
I mean, more, there seems to be this notion that it's the bottom tier carriers who are having problems. And obviously, it's the only way that you can sort of have to define who's a bottom tier carrier is that whether or not they've bought the options on it. So to what degree was engineering aware of the optionality of these features versus just assuming that, well, of course, everyone would have that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because just communication is a big issue here. And that this came up in reports after the fact by the joint authorities looking at what went wrong. I mean, they looked at just siloization and that certain units would have information and others wouldn't. And so you had even months before the Max was delivered, one engineer asked another, and this came out in the congressional investigation, what happens if we have a faulty AOA? And then the other engineer says, if that happens, Mcas shuts down immediately. So even at that late stage, there was bad information going around, and there was an assumption about what was happening, which wasn't true.
And Matt, I think you had a second question then.
Yeah, the other one was, how different is Mcas from other types of fly-by-wire systems that we're more used to seeing, right? At this point, in pretty much every aircraft, it's actually the computer flying the plane and the pilot flying the computer. And, aside from whatever illusion the pilot has that he is in control, how is MCAS substantially different, or is it just that it's based off faulty sensor data?
Yeah, it's not, the people working at the time, thought of it as just another function. There is there's another feature that controls the spoilers on landing, which they, some people that I talked to thought that they considered that to be more of a change than MCAS. I mean, the issue was that it's one thing that was said to me was that there should have been more scrutiny because MCAS the tail is a really powerful control surface, and within just 30-40 seconds it's able to crash the plane. So that's one critical feature of it. But in terms of it being software controlling software involved in the flight controls, you're right. That's not unusual.
So that's an interesting point, though, about the tail, because I do feel that part of what makes these crashes so tragic is that all of them lost all lives, which it does feel like in that regard, it looks like the JAL 123, it looks like the rudder hardover that the 737 suffered from. You made reference to the Flight 427 US Air and the, growing up in Colorado, the Colorado Springs crash, the UA 585. It does feel like the tail deserves special treatment from an engineering perspective, because it feels like it's being activated at low altitude when you've got the rudder and ailerons are being. Is that a fair read? I'm not a pilot. It does feel like it's a high risk surface.
Yeah, and that's why some people early on in the development, they didn't. One axiom is, if you've got a hardware problem, that you should have a hardware solution. And so when this pitch up tendency was noticed because of the bigger engines, one thought was that they could put what's called vortilons on the wings, and that might change the performance. But the software has the advantage of being quicker and cheaper, and so the software approach was used. And in high speed, it was tied to two sensors. That was one point we didn't cover, but the initially, because it was acting only at high speeds, it would have responded to both the AOA and this other sensor called the accelerometer. And then it was only later that it was added to this low speed regime, so the accelerometer just didn't factor into it because you're at a low speed.
Well, and you have these like small decisions that are accruing, and people are clearly losing track of the larger picture, and not realizing that the consequence. It seems like it was very consequential to start engaging this thing at low speed.
Yeah, and again, you didn't have someone you didn't have a Joe Sutter figure who was keeping track of all these incremental changes and was noting how these pieces fit into the whole. The manager of the program after the first flight test got a congratulatory call from one of his managers, and got some additional stock. So it's possible that his mind was elsewhere at that time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him up, because I've got Michael Teal underlined here. So Michael Teal was the chief engineer. You point out that he has no direct reports, or the organization doesn't report into him, which seems like a funny way of doing it.
Yeah.
Were you shocked that he seemed to know so little about how important the single AOA was?
Yeah, and you had that from him. You had that from his manager, who's a business unit VP, and you had that from the chief of safety at the FAA, just professing very little technical knowledge and very little awareness of what technical changes were being made, and it just struck me that at every stage, there was Keith Leverkusen was the manager who supervised Teal, and he summarized the late change to Mcas as being, problem found, solution available. So that was the level of briefing and technical discussion that was going up the chain.
Did you find that shocking? I mean, I guess one question I definitely have for you is like, what you surely had some moments in the story where you just couldn't believe what you were seeing. Certainly as a reader, I had moments where I couldn't believe what I was reading. What were some of those moments for you?
I was surprised by I was surprised by the infidelities we discussed earlier. I was surprised. I was surprised that there isn't more, that there wasn't more discussion, open discussion, and after the crash, I continue to be surprised that Boeing's executives have continued to stonewall and haven't engaged in any kind of meaningful discussion, and that there hasn't been any real house cleaning at the company. That's surprising to me.
So that's surprising to me too. I am also, I have to say, surprised that I was going just to the Boeing website in preparation for this, and they're remarkably candid though about the 737 Max, and they've got this kind of memoriam to the Lion Air and Ethiopian Air. I mean, does that reflect a deeper cultural change in Boeing, or does that feel superficial to you?
I'd have to look specifically at what you're talking about there, but they. I mean, if you read there was an interview that Boeing's current commercial airplane chief Stan Deal gave to Dominic Gates at the Seattle Times, and there was not any open reflection. It was declined to comment about anything to do with the 737 Max. So yes, in situations Boeing controls, they, I think, control the message, but I haven't seen them engage in any meaningful dialogue about it since Dave Calhoun became CEO.
And what has their reaction been to the book?
They've not commented publicly on it. Yeah,
because it's a real
nor is
opportunity.
the FAA.
Really, you just feel like this is such an opportunity to, I mean, welcome the book first of all, but also like if people are dedicated to changing Boeing and change the FAA, the book presents, I think, a great opportunity to have that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real. Maybe I would count myself. That's surprising to me as well, but that may be part of the public relations strategy.
Yeah, interesting. Simeon, sorry, you got your hand up. Did you have a question for Peter?
I'm so glad that you mentioned the FAA because it's sort of related. I remember at the time reading about the role of the FAA, the role of the operators, and the role of Boeing, and it all seems quite puzzling. And then something that was mentioned at the time was the competitive pressure from the Airbus, A320neo, as an alternative narrow body aircraft. And it got me to wondering if and to what extent there was a sort of a Team USA factor, especially considering the FAA.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, and that may have played into it as well, because there was this cultural shift at the FAA where managers at the FAA felt that part of their role was in speeding designs toward completion and in meeting, quote, stakeholder needs, and that meant doing things on the manufacturer's schedule. So that's what kinds of pressure the FAA engineers were experiencing when it came to Boeing models. At the same time, I talked to some specialists who were noting at the FAA that changes that the FAA would let Boeing not meet with the Max not meet current regulations on some of the fuel tank designs, but it was insisting on circuit breaker surge protection and things like that on the A320neo design. So I did wonder myself about whether the FAA was playing into this Team America mentality,
which ultimately ended up very much harming Team America. And that was it just like, I think that just like the financial engineering, I mean, it ultimately, this isn't just the wrong thing to do. It doesn't even serve the goal. It's like we effectively, even if the regulator viewed their role as serving Boeing, they undermined Boeing by allowing them by not regulating them better. Is that is that a totally unfair
in the long run? Yeah, I mean, you see how it plays out in the long run, and if you don't balance customers and employees, communities in the long run, that hurts you.
So yeah, I mean, I guess what is the kind of the lesson for those folks that you get a lot of folks that are technologists who are software engineers. What do you feel is kind of some of the lessons that we can kind of apply to other organizations here?
Yeah, it's well, I mean, we've covered some of them, but it's listening to employees, valuing employees' views, not structuring an organization so that it's top down to the point that bad news isn't filtering up. I mean, there were many moments that I described in the book where you had managers, all but insisting that people not give them bad news,
right,
and that is always harmful. So it's just being willing to engage in this open dialogue and to change your mind if you need to, and it maybe it would have been inconvenient or not the plan to develop a new plane, but it would have been the better strategic decision.
I'm glad you bring up bad news, because I mean, this is certainly one of my rubric for technological leadership is how well do you deal with bad news? When you're solving anything ambitious, there's going to be bad news, and you've got to have an organization that encourages that bad news, as opposed to trying to squelch it. And I think that because ultimately, like, whether you're receptive to the bad news or not doesn't change the fact that it's bad news, which part of the challenge here, clearly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Peter, if there's a villain in the book, and there actually are probably several, it's this sort of Jack Welch and the disciples, shoveling all of the value and virtue of Boeing into this furnace of capitalism. And one of the dark thoughts I sort of had as reading through it was just, is this the kind of high entropy state of all organizations? Because it seemed like Boeing's engineering kind of held together, but it was so easy to unravel, so hard to build, and then so easy to unravel.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, that is that is ultimately what I took away from this experience of moving, here to Seattle and finding this company that was so embedded in the fabric of the city and the history, and it's moved to Chicago within a few years of my being here, and now it's unrecognizable from what it was. So it didn't take long at all. And it's not alone either. There's not, you could write this same story about lots of other American companies.
And do you feel there's a path back for Boeing?
I think you would need to change. I think you would need to do what we were talking about, and it would need to fully accept that, fully change the strategy and accept that you need to return to what existed before. But I'm not sure that's happening.
It's tough to internalize. Matt, I think probably time for one more question for Peter.
Yeah. So I've got. To what degree do you think the F-35 is involved in this? Because the story I had always heard for Boeing buying out McDonnell Douglas was that basically McDonnell lost the F-35 program. Their commercial program was basically in shambles, and that Boeing thought it would add more credibility in terms of the government bidding on the F-35 contract. Needless to say, that didn't work out too well for them. But that McDonnell was not so much purchased for its commercial division as much as it was for its non-commercial division. And obviously there is some level of cultural difference between what you're looking for in a fighter jet and what you're looking for in a commercial airliner. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, it does show how, a decision made for one reason can have these cascading effects. And certainly, I have been told that McDonnell Douglas wouldn't have been on the block and if it hadn't lost the F-35. Again, I think there were also moments in the book where the military side of Boeing was pushing the leadership to do things, for expedient reasons, for military contracts. Let's move the 747 production to California, so it helps us get military contracts. If that did factor into the thinking, I think it's another example of expediency, triumphing over just the self-confidence. That's Boeing became what it was in the jet age because of its self-confidence and its the belief that its products were best.
Well,
and didn't need these extras.
You could also make the argument about, expediency is one way to put it, but on the other hand, if you think about the sorts of autopilots that are being engaged on these aircraft, right? Modern jet fighters could not be flown by a human, right?
Mm-hmm.
They rely entirely on their computers to not fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
And so one could imagine that if you've just lost the F-35 program and you have a bunch of autopilot programmers lying around at around the same time you were starting, I don't know if Boeing had that level of cross-pollination between the divisions, or, like, not being a Boeing covering journalist, I don't really know how they operate.
I've got that same question, because it seems to me that they are pretty different sides of the house. Is there any cross-pollination between the military and the commercial side?
Yeah, they've tried to. The hope of management is that, while you have these people doing essentially the same thing, we should be able to get synergy and cut costs, and you can merge the flight tests and have military pilots doing what commercial pilots are doing, but often that ends up being counterproductive, because you do need to have a separate military flight test operation, because those pilots know fighters best, and the commercial pilots know on a daily basis how anybody is actually flying the plane, which a military test pilot doesn't know. And that also played into the Mcas, because the flight test operation was led by a former military pilot who didn't have that kind of daily immersion in what a commercial pilot is doing.
And just out of curiosity, do you have any idea what the background and pedigree of that military pilot was? Just only asking because basically I have heard that the B-2 Spirit has something that's almost exactly Mcas. Bearing in mind that it's a Delta wing, so they fall out of the sky if you don't computer them anyway.
Sorry, you broke up after B-2 Spirit?
Just, I know you'd mentioned that there was a military pilot there. Was he transport? Was he test pilot, fighter, bomber?
Oh, I was talking about Craig Bombin, who is still currently the head of Boeing flight tests. But yeah, his experience is fighters primarily.
Yeah.
And then I think we got, a couple questions. Just if Peter, you got time for two more questions?
Sure.
The one question came in from Gene Kim, who I don't know if he's here or not, but wanted to get your reaction to the CEO congressional testimony. Did you feel that there were? I actually, you made reference to the committee report, which I thought was actually very good. I got into it because of the book. But did you feel that the committee, were there questions that should have been asked that weren't, or how did you find the testimony there?
Yeah, I think that the House committee, really did dig into the issue, and I relied heavily, and as you can see from reading the footnotes, I relied heavily on that report. But in the testimony, I guess the frustrating thing was that in all of these congressional hearings, you'll have these grandstanding questions, and you had a great opening question from Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, who asked Muhlenberg, when did you learn that the MCAS would not be in the flight manual? Because he had dissembled about that question in a Fox business interview after the Lion Air crash, and had led viewers to believe that MCAS was in the manual. And as Blumenthal well knew, by at least February after the first crash, it had been brought to his attention that a pilot, in the organization had raised concerns about changes in the MCAS and what had been told the FAA. So that would have been a great thread to continue following and continue asking, who did you talk to? What were you told? Really, what did you know, and when did you know it? Especially in that period between the two crashes, would be really important to know.
Yeah, interesting. And I you should know that Adam is a son of the great state of Connecticut. Are you waving your Connecticut flag right now?
Oh yeah, I'm a nutmegger for sure. Although Dick Blumenthal was not well loved growing up, but yeah, that questioning that you described was terrific. And I would also say that it was the most positively I've felt about Ted Cruz ever, in your description in the book.
Sorry, I think I missed the end of that.
Oh. Ted Cruz came off well in your book, which was surprising to me and disturbing to me.
Yeah, he did. He put on his tough lawyer hat, and he did put Muhlenberg on the spot.
Well, and I was actually relieved that there was a bipartisan agreement that the FAA has actually outsourced too much of this, and it sounds like they've made at least they've wound back some of the regulatory changes, which. When in a divided time, when parties agree on something, it's got to be really acute. So then one of the last question for you, Peter, was the original issue that the test pilot Ed Wilson ran into at kind of the outside of the flight envelope. That issue, how severe would that issue have? Would they not have been able to get certification? Had they not fixed that issue at all? If they'd done nothing, if they'd not done anything for MCAS, would they have failed their certification?
This has been described. It was raised as this is a certification issue. It needs to be fixed. I think people that I've talked to have said that you could have addressed it in a different way, by restricting the loading in the back of the plane, and you could have maybe changed the flight envelope of the plane but that would have been a separate conversation to have, that you would have potentially not loaded in passengers into certain conditions. So yeah, I mean it is fascinating to think that you may not have even needed MCAS at all if a different approach had been taken.
Yeah, and certainly if they had done what was clearly the approach that was preferred by at least some of your sources of actually taking the 777 approach and really not. I do think it's funny that the 737 MAX had so much technical debt, they had no way of naming it, because it would have been the 737. It should have been the 737 1000, right? But they didn't want to call it the 1000. So it's like just there's kind of a cruel irony there. Well, Peter, thank you very, very much for enduring the rough road that is Twitter Spaces.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Great questions, and thanks so much for reading the book so carefully.
It was a great book. I honestly, again, very well written. I mean, it was a page turner. I feel like I don't know that I've ripped through a book this quickly since Bad Blood. I mean, it was and it definitely had some Bad Blood overtones, but I actually feel that there's a lot more to learn here than there is because I feel like there's a lot that feels familiar. And certainly, Adam, you must have felt that there's a lot that felt familiar to you.
Hence the dark feelings about kind of corporations in general. And Peter, I would just say I read this on a plane recently. I did check in that the aircraft I was on was an Airbus aircraft before I cracked the book, just because I felt like I was already nervous enough about flying. But congratulations on the book and the acclaim that it's getting. It's awesome and well deserved acclaim.
And absolutely, and I think this should be required reading for engineers of all variety. I would like to see, of course, we in software engineering need to take responsibility for our roles in this. So, it should be mandatory reading. So, thank you very much for a terrific book.
Thank you. Thanks again. And yeah, I'm happy to endure it. It wasn't so much to endure after all. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for the great questions, and we'll see you next time.
Right.
See ya.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.